Our author tonight is Nick Laird, who is here to talk to us about his new novel, which is his third, Modern Gods. He was once a student at Cambridge and at Harvard. He's now on the creative writing faculty at New York University. He's an award-winning poet, and a poet's style of attention to language, both precise and surprising, is part of the power of his new work. Like so many great stories, it's a global one where faraway lands reveal similar attributes beneath their surface differences, and they link two sisters across the hemispheres from Laird's own homeland in Northern Ireland all the way to Papua New Guinea. Both of them lands notably touched by colonialism, and the ripple effects of that have greatly shaped both of their modern histories. So tonight he will be joined in conversation by Nate Brown, who's a literary presence both regional and national as managing editor of American Short Fiction magazine. So on that note, I will leave it to them. And please join me in welcoming Nick Laird and Nate Brown.
Hi, everybody. Thank you very much for being here. Literary presence, both local and national. I'll take it. I'm really excited and delighted to be here tonight to be in conversation with Nick Laird. Modern Gods is his third novel, as was mentioned. He's also got 3 incredible collections of poetry. We're going to kind of go in this order tonight. I'm going to ask Nick to read for us briefly, kind of an 8 to 10 segment of the book. Then I've prepared a few questions for him, both about his broader career and about the book, and then we'll open it up to you guys to ask anything you've got. So, Nick Laird, it's all you.
Nice to see you all. Thanks very much for coming out. So I'm going to read a wee standalone section, really. The book is about 2 sisters, but this is a section about their parents, who are called Ken and Judith. One of the sisters, Alison, has married a guy and has discovered that this guy has a sort of has a past. He's been responsible for one of the sort of famous atrocities in Northern Ireland, and has been released early after a year under the Good Friday Agreement. Judith, the mother, is ill. She's got ovarian cancer, and this is a section about Ken and Judith going down to the Republic of Ireland to pray on a cross. I'll just read this. It's only 8 minutes, and then we'll have a chat. So here we go. Okay. That's a heavy-looking sky. Said, I think it's Ken says that. There's no names on this bit. Do you want to stop at McElhinney's? Have we time? I mean, afterwards. On the way back up, Ken didn't reply. The implication was too obvious. Wasn't that what afterwards meant? Where else would they be going but back up to Ballyglass from Mullingar? He shifted gear down to second with undisguised impatience and pulled up behind a van going through the toll gate. Judith looked out the window at the low green fields, the tall metallic sky. A rainbow arced faintly out to the west, and she kept it to herself. You got the €2? I just gave them to you. Did you speak to Alison? She texted this morning, and she's okay. Did she ask about the kids? Of course. I told her Tricia was happy to take them for the day. I don't know how she can stand it. Judith said nothing. Ken continued, Don't you ever think that if a man like that knew what destruction he had brought, really brought to people, how he'd ruined them? Yes. What? I'm agreeing with you. I haven't finished. Sorry. If he knew what he'd really done, he wouldn't be able to live. It was a wee estate on the outskirts of Mullingar. The semi-detached was pebble-dashed, and Ken pushed the doorbell. Hugh Tracy was tall, bald, overweight, and possessed of less than the regulation number of upper teeth. A benign ogre in a navy velour tracksuit, he talked and talked as he ushered them into the small hot living room where turf crackled in the grate and the blinds were shut. The cross was my grandmother's, and before that I don't know. I don't think it's particularly old, though. Will you have tea? Not for me, thank you. We stopped outside Louth and had a coffee. Oh, very good. Judith's heart had a kind of twisted energy in it now. She set her bag down on the little side table. It was covered with a lacy tablecloth, galactic swirls of crochet. It was yellow, and Judith couldn't decide if it was age or dirt or meant to be yellow. She noticed that every surface in the room was covered with drapes, materials, fringes. My wife had a brain tumour, and she preyed on it, said Hugh Tracy without preamble. And how is she now? Asked Ken. Oh, she's dead. She died, unfortunately. Judith looked at Ken, who was staring hard at the fire. She could see his determination to keep his temper. It was in the set of his mouth, the clasp of his hands. Sit yourselves down, I'm just going to get it. Hugh disappeared, and a cushion came alive in the depths of the sofa, stretched itself and walked along the sofa arm. Hello, Puss Puss, said Kenneth, and scratched the cat's neck. Judith perched on the edge of a rickety wooden seat by the little drop-leafed dining table. A pack of cards, branded with Benson and Hedges, sat by a folded-up Irish News with a half-completed quick crossword. A little vista of the lonely days of Hugh Tracy unfolded itself before her. I see you met Buster. Ah, he's a terror. Hugh stood in the doorway, cradling the cross, his smooth brown eyes shining. It was maybe 18 inches tall, and he set it on the coffee table in front of them. Old, carved, dark bogwood, naked, no Jesus. It had a circular copper base. He pulled a prayer card from a bookshelf stuffed with John Grisham and Patricia Cornwell novels. Ken? Yes. No, don't stand up. Now, I want Judith, if you could place both your hands on the cross here. Hugh held his white puffy hands out, and Judith leaned forward and rested her own hands on the cross's bar. Ken saw the nervousness in the pools of his wife's eyes, and it made him straighten his back and square his shoulders and give her a little supportive smile. Her own shoulders were hunched forward in sorrow and apology. Hugh moved around them, arranging. He set the prayer card beside the cross. And if you read this prayer out 3 times while Judith holds the cross, I'm going to leave you to it now. Hugh held the door to the kitchen open for Buster, who gave one bored, clean yawn and paraded out first, steered by his tail. They sat facing each other now across the coffee table. Their eyes made contact for the millionth time in the 44 years they'd shared, and Judith raised her eyebrows. Like all long marriages, theirs had been sustained by many forms of surrender and deceit and kindness, but in all those 44 years they had never prayed together. Ken again tried to reassure her by widening and brightening his glance back at her. Shall I start? Yes. I should turn my phone off? Yes. He did that and then picked up the card and read out the prayer. Lord, we ask that you look upon the sick with eyes of mercy. May your healing hand be set upon us. May your life-giving powers flow into every cell of our bodies and into the depths of our souls, cleansing, purifying and restoring us to wholeness and strength for service in your kingdom. Though we cannot see a way, Lord, we are sure that you can. Amen. Hugh must have been listening at the door. As soon as Ken had finished reading the prayer the 3rd time, his voice getting stronger each time, he pushed the door open and smiled at them. All done? All done. Now you're more than welcome to come back any time you like. Ach, well, it's a long enough drive. You're Ballyglass, aren't you? We are. Do you know Neil's Butchers? Declan would be a cousin of my mother. Oh, very good. Kenneth stood and put his sports jacket back on. Judith was already by the door. She said, can we pay you for your time? Well, I can't take any money for myself, obviously, but if you want to leave me €50, say, I'll give it to a charity. Ken slid his wallet out of his jacket and plucked a note from it. He laid it carefully on the table by the pack of cards. It was a relief to get back out to the pale light of afternoon, the cold air. Judith felt curiously weightless, almost floated to the car. Thanks for coming down with me. I'm sure it was all a waste of time. Not a problem. Waved to him. He stood there at the doorway. Both of them waved. The house was so hot and dark, noted Ken. I feel I should try everything, said his wife very quietly, hardly aiming to be heard. Might as well. Which charity do you think the money will go to? The Hugh Tracy Memorial Fund? Shall we stop at McElhinney's? Do you want to? I think about it sometimes, about when it began to grow and I never noticed. She felt the warmth of the prayer, of the blessing, fade out as he started the car. He held his hand to the key a long time and looked stoically out the windscreen. Just one of those things. Do you think it was there the summer Isabel was born? She's the grandchild. Ken didn't reply. I know you don't want to talk about it. Ken stayed silent. He pulled out of the estate and onto the N14. The steering wheel passed under his hands smoothly. The car swallowed the tarmac. I don't see what the point is, he said eventually. I want to talk about it, Judith said quickly. That's the point. Don't I get to talk about it if I want to? Of course, Ken said softly. It's inside me, not you. She had the sudden sense that in all their years together she had failed utterly to get a single point across. If they dovetailed together, if they fitted, it was only because she had deformed and shaped herself out of all recognition. Where was that glossy, hopeful little girl with the navy book bag and the hair clip with red butterflies on it?
I'm going to ask Nick a few questions about his kind of broader writing life, and then I'm going to provide a couple of details about the family in this book, because that will help make sense of the questions I'm going to ask. Maybe we'll do that first. I'm going to give you the lay of the land. The section you just heard about Ken and Judith, these are the parents. They have 3 children. The oldest is Liz, followed by Alison, and the youngest is a son named Spencer. Alison, the middle daughter, has 2 kids who also play a pretty important role in the novel. Isabel, the elder sister, and Mickey, the little tot, kind of toddling around and getting himself into dangerous situations. The book is very much about family dynamics and about the choice of some characters to put family at the center of their lives, or to not do that and to leave. Specifically, the 2 women at the center of the story are Liz and Alison. Liz is an academic. She's an anthropologist who's gone to New York and teaches, and Alison has stayed home and really is kind of there for her family. She and Spencer both work in Ken's real estate agency, kind of a family business. So this makes Liz really the black sheep. And I want to kind of start there because in your other 2 novels, you deal with family dynamics, and you certainly deal with family dynamics, and you reckon with history in your poems as well. But what was different in Modern Gods is you're dealing with 2 sisters, and I think in your other 2 novels, you're largely dealing with male characters, and here you've got 2 very strong, very memorable, and very different and oppositional sisters who are at once butting heads, even as they wouldn't like to be butting heads. You get the sense that they both want reconciliation and friendship, but they just don't quite know how to find it. So the first very long question out of the gate is, why?
Like you keep talking.
Why are they at the center of this novel? I mean, I have some ideas having read it, but why? Where did you come up with these 2, and how did they become the story that you ultimately tell?
Well, I think it's. My mother used to say that we were reared for export, and certainly that's a common thing in Ireland. Like everyone leaves, and those who don't leave stay, which is it's an incredibly profound statement. But so I was interested in those who left and those who stayed and how that interacts. Part of that is my own sort of family history. I come from a big family. I've only 1 sibling, but I've 43 cousins, and some of them went and some of them stayed. And that sibling interaction is interesting to me. I think at one point, Alison and Liz, who are the 2 sisters in the book, are talking, and there's a kind of pity competition. One is pity, and the other one is pitying her back even harder. It's like who can. So I wanted to think about that, what it meant to go away and what it meant to stay, and that's something that comes back again and again in my work. In the poems and the prose. Spencer is obviously he's a male character, but you're right. It's a step off to the side for me to write about sisters. I think in a way I just got older, and I didn't want to write the same book again. So I wanted it to be. I'm 41 now, and I've had kids, and so I've been writing poetry for the last wee while. And then about 5 years ago, I started to write this book, and it was just different. I was concerned with different things, and I wanted to think about different things. I'd had kids, my mother had died, a lot of things had happened to me, and I wanted to kind of exercise that in some way, to think it through. So that's what the book became about.
So then, sort of to push on that a little bit, are you consciously then, because your 3 novels are all quite different from each other, Utterly Monkey is actually quite funny. This is quite serious. Yeah. It has levity too. There are moments, but like 3.
Dude, don't say that. It's full of humor.
It is.
It's incredibly witty, this book. Yeah.
But he's not wrong. That's that dark Irish humor. So the question then is, when you're starting a new project, are you intentionally then pivoting away from what you've done before for the sake of not repeating yourself, or is it more following your nose into whatever you're interested in at the time?
well, I can't be interested in doing the same thing again. And I don't think that's unusual, but I don't want to write the same book again. I'm much more interested in going somewhere else. And part of the reason this book has the shape it has, like this home and away sections, like this Northern Irish section set in Ulster, and then this section set in a fictional island of Papua New Guinea called New Ulster, which is a sort of cross between New Britain and New Ireland, which are real islands, but it was partly to kind of stretch the legs, as it were, to see how far you could go and keep it interesting. And the two halves come to be thematically coherent, I hope. So they both end up being about, let's say, negotiations with the dead, how to talk to the past in lots of ways. So I don't know if that's what you were asking.
No, that's incredibly helpful.
Right.
I'll show you, by way of example, my wife is a poet, and she always gives me trouble when I flag books. She says I flag fiction far more than I've ever flagged her manuscripts. And I said, well, fiction's longer. But I put these vertical flags in at every moment in the book that I could find where this particular event, this really awful shooting, that took place not long before the Good Friday Accords. It starts the book, and it works as a prologue. You're not situated as a reader to understand fully what's going on. You know it's related to the Troubles, and you get the sense that it's either Sinn Féin or the UFF, the Ulster Freedom Fighters. It becomes clear as you read on, and in the first half of the book, the narrative stops, and you get essentially like a piece of flash fiction about each victim of that shooting. And it's arresting, not just because, I'm patting you on the back here, not just because you're a great prose writer, but because the book then is mirroring in form what's happening to these characters, who, as they move forward in time, they're constantly reminded of the Troubles and constantly reminded of tragedy and death. You then, as a reader, are reminded as you're moving through this narrative, the prose totally stops for a second, and I get the story of someone who's dead. So it's really replicating in form what's happening to those characters emotionally.
Right. Well spotted, because those sections they used to be called violent interruption, and each section was a violent interruption, both in the prose itself and in real life.
And they're upsetting.
Yeah.
Yeah. That the first pages of the book, when you actually see the shooting in Eden, I have to apologize up front. My pronunciation of place names is going to be really brutal. You put anything Irish or British in an American mouth, and gross becomes grass. So I apologize. Thank God the shooting is in Eden, because that I can say.
Eden.
Yeah. It's at the Days End pub, and this is an odd thing too. I think because sentence to sentence, your prose is quite beautiful. Not purple, not really elaborate particularly, but it's heavily metaphoric. The shooting scene is utterly violent. It's upsetting, but it doesn't have a lick of irony. It's not an Elmore Leonard book, and it's not an Irving Welsh book. And I'm wondering how it felt to write that, because it's visceral.
Well, upsetting actually. I don't think that there's any space for irony in that kind of topic, and you want to kind of be true to the event in some way. It's based on a real shooting. It was called the Grey Steel Massacre, and it happened in the same time as the one in the book. And it's two fellas went into a bar, and it was just before Halloween, and they had Halloween masks on, and they shouted "trick or treat," and they killed a lot of people. And I was 17 or 18 when it happened, and I had lost lots of friends in the Troubles and bombs and different things, but this one somehow was grotesque in a new way, partly because of this shouting "trick or treat," and I don't want to say everything that's in the book, but it stuck with me in some way. So I knew that if I was going to write it, I wanted to write about that. As it turned out, one of the guys who did it turned up. After he was released, he turned up in my town, in Cookstown, and lived there for 10 years. And a friend of mine had worked with him for 2 years, not knowing who he was. So I never met the guy, I don't know him, but that was the sort of kernel for what I was interested in, what it was to have done this unbelievably destructive, awful thing, and then come back into society and try and rehabilitate in some way, and to be exposed, because he gets exposed in the book whenever he marries Alison, and so things come tumbling down, and that happens a lot in Northern Ireland. And one of my neighbours, her husband was shot dead whenever she was in the hospital having their first child, and no one was arrested for it. And then 20 years later, with DNA advances, there was a cigarette butt in the hospital car park, and they found out the guy who did it was her neighbour, and he went into prison and spent a year in prison and was then released. And now she has to, when she drives up to the crossroads in her car and stops, sometimes this fella drives up to the crossroads and stops at things just to see this guy. So how a society works like that is sort of interesting to me. It's an unusual situation. It's akin to Rwanda. Obviously Rwanda or whatever is a lot more deaths, but in a kind of microcosm, what Northern Ireland has had to eat is pretty astonishing. Not always successfully, I have to say, but yeah.
Yeah, and this has been something, I mean, not to put too fine a point on it, but you were born in 75, and Bloody Sunday was 72. And people kind of track the troubles from the late 60s, about 68 to 30 years later, 98 with the Good Friday Accords, which afforded things like prison releases, and there were a number of compromises made on each side. It's famous for bringing largely an end to this. But my question for you then is, so for your entire life, you're from County Tyrone, one of the 6 northern counties. You've been obviously aware of the troubles. You've visited it many times in poetry and in fiction. I'm curious to know today, given Brexit and the questions of what's going to happen to that border, just not to take it too far away from the book, but how are you feeling now? What do things seem like for you and your family?
It's a disaster, to be honest. I mean, I don't know what is going to happen, and if they reintroduce a hard border because of Brexit, there will be a whole heap of trouble. I don't know the answer. I mean, I'm in a weird spot slightly because my father is from Donegal, which is in the south, although confusingly it's the northernmost county on the island, but it's in the south in terms of it's part of the Republic. And my mother is from Cork, and we have always been Irish passport holders, and my parents would both believe in a united Ireland, as would I, but at the same point we're Protestants. And relatives of mine were police, and my dad was at the Bloody Sunday demonstrations, and he hid under a car for 3 hours, and another uncle was there as a policeman. And then when I became a lawyer, ended up working for a year and a half on the Bloody Sunday Inquiry. So we're in a weird situation whereby you can feel enormous sympathy towards the Protestant community, and which you're part of, but you can also think that the border, the partition in 1920 was a total disaster. It's like the way they partitioned Pakistan and India. Suddenly you have a Muslim country and a Hindu country. It doesn't work like that. And it's the same that thing that happened in Ireland. You had a kind of Protestant country and a Catholic country, and it would have been much better, obviously, if it had been a kind of plural country for everybody. And I feel like it would have. That was where the problem began. But Brexit is terrifying. I don't know what will happen, and things are hardening. Like there was a recent election there, not to go into too much detail, but there's 2 kind of, let's say, moderate parties, the official unionists and the SDLP, a kind of moderate unionist party and a moderate nationalist party. And then there's the kind of more extreme parties, the Sinn Féin and the DUP. And the two moderate parties lost all their seats. The only parties that have seats now are the DUP and Sinn Féin. So positions have hardened in a really frightening way.
Yeah, I think we know polemics from our own government as well.
Yes, yes. Well, it's not, this idea of, we all know the reasons for it, like these hardening positions which are your own beliefs are reinforced by these filter bubbles and these sort of echo chambers of content that we talk about all the time now in social media and everything else. But Northern Ireland, remember, is such a strange, odd. It's the only place in Europe which is entirely led by identity politics. I mean, where you vote is what you're born into. So it's completely backward in a way. And yet I feel now everyone is moving towards this identity politics. Like everyone is moving towards, if you're born into a certain family, I don't know, in Kentucky or whatever, you will become a Republican. If you're born into a family, say on the East Coast, whatever, you become a Democrat. So these things they're not dissimilar.
Yeah, which actually makes Liz in the book sort of an exceptional character in multiple ways. In a family where the kids have stayed home and have supported the parents and have joined the family business, Liz then is the outlier. She, in fact, considers herself a black sheep. And she's the eldest child, but you learn early in the book that she has long felt that Alison's, in fact, the more responsible sister, that Alison's played the role of big sister because Liz felt she was either too flighty or too irresponsible or sort of too much of a wanderer. So she ends up in New York. She goes back to Ireland. And in fact, it's worth noting that this family, the Donnellys, they live in the Republic of Ireland. They're in Ballyglass, aren't they?
Ballyglass is in Tyrone now.
Oh, it's in Tyrone, okay.
It's a Cookstown surrogate, yeah. It's where I'm from is the town, yeah. It's mid-Ulster.
Okay, good to know. That was a bad reading on my part. So my question about Liz then is, you've got this whole other sectarian divide in the book that has nothing to do with the conflict between Catholics and Protestants. Liz sort of incidentally is invited to help create a BBC documentary. She's an anthropologist in the fictional island of New Ulster, which is just to the east of Papua New Guinea. So she goes down there to investigate this burgeoning new religion called the Story. And it becomes very, very clear that both Liz is a capable anthropologist, but that the forces around her, both the forces of Western missionaries and the forces of this indigenous new religion, or perhaps a cult, are not something she can quite either wrap her head around, fully participate in, or fully treat as an anthropologist with kind of appropriate academic distance. So she gets herself into some trouble there, and a few incredibly disturbing things happen to her and to the film crew. And it's completely fascinating. I didn't know a thing about cargo cults before this. I'm going to ask you to... has anyone heard of a cargo cult? Okay, great. It's really interesting.
So am I.
Yeah. So, well, Nick, can you give us some context there and how your research for this went? Because it is really fascinating. I've obsessed with cargo cults for many, many years. Yeah. Partly because it becomes a metaphor for almost everything. Cargo cult, like nationalism becomes a cargo cult, like Trump becomes a cargo Capitalism.
cult. Yeah.
Colonialism.
So this idea that at some point in the future, the cargo will come. So that has always seemed to me a disastrous idea. But there's a story about David Attenborough, who you all know who David Attenborough is. He's a BBC natural history guy, and he went to an island called Vanuatu, just off Fiji, and they had a cargo cult called the David From. You know this, and so I think it's in 1960 maybe, or 1970, and he meets this cargo cult, and they so like the word cargo, CARGO, yeah, and
It's pretty literal.
Yeah, so this tribe in Vanuatu worship a fella called John From, and they think it's a corruption of John From America, because the GIs had arrived in 1944 or whatever, arrived with, ice boxes and jeeps and tanks, and the people who lived on the island were really living a Stone Age existence, and suddenly, metal birds in the sky bringing all of this stuff, and then they left again, and the tribe continued to worship this John From figure, waiting for him to come back. And David Attenborough says to this leader of the cargo cult, you've been waiting now for 20 years for John From to come back. He's not coming, is he? And the guy says to him, well, you've been waiting for 2,000 years for Jesus Christ. So
he's not wrong.
But so Christianity itself, in a way, becomes a cargo cult. There's lots of, and I think part of the idea of the book was that these things, like nationalism, like where you work towards this imagined ideal future, are scary to me, and that tends to result in is mob violence, and terrible things are done in the name of it. So I was much more interested in locating kind of transcendence in little moments. I think as a poet and a fiction writer, one always does that. Like, I don't know, the way the light falls on the wall, or describing an animal, or whatever it is you see, those little moments of transcendence, Spinoza calls them the eternal. They exist all around us at all times. It's not some imagined future. So cargo cults in the book became a kind of metaphor for me for all of the problems, like nationalism and the violence that accompanies that, like religion and the violence that accompanies that. So I could never get away from cargo cults. I knew I wanted to write a book about them as soon as I read about them. Yeah.
Well, it's something like I said I'd never heard of. It's completely fascinating to me. But what I so appreciated about the cargo cult in the book is that the charismatic leader of this cult is a mom. I've been saying Belef in my head, Belef, which is a near homonym for belief, of course.
Yeah,
But
I mean, weirdly, it was only pointed out to me
in the Egan
by the
review?
editor.
Oh,
no, yeah,
okay.
yeah. And he was like, "Is it related to belief?" And I was like, "Oh, yeah, it's very similar." So your unconscious just sort of messes with you.
for as discomforting rather as the tenets of the belief system of the story are, there's also a couple of beautiful beliefs that Belef expresses in the book. But at heart, I was so impressed that there's a moment where she almost kills one of her own children, and it's an extraordinarily upsetting moment. At the same time, you sort of understand that her motivation for starting this new religion, the story, is born of her desire to be close to her dead daughter. It's born of the desire to be intimate with your children. So she buries her child outside of her own home, which is illegal. You're supposed to bury them in the churchyard per the missionaries' law, but also just for sanitary reasons. And when you sort of realize that, I found myself as a reader feeling great sympathy for her, which is strange, having sympathy for someone who's really not well and who's founded a belief system that is pretty troubling in some ways.
I like her.
So do I.
Yeah.
Which you maybe shouldn't. I don't know. It's just a tough one.
Yeah.
It's almost Greek in its way. I mean, it's like Antigone. She's trying to do right by. She's trying to do right by her children. She's also trying to ease her own pain, and there's much to sympathize with there. I think, in fact, it's not unlike Judith, the mom, who is not well herself in the novel,
Right.
and who so desperately wants to be close to her children, even if she can't help but maybe chide them a little too much here and there, or say, not always say
So
the right
one
thing.
of the reasons that I did concentrate on female characters is because I was interested in what violence has done in these situations to women, and women tend to be the ones who are left behind a lot of the time. And in Papua New Guinea, for example, really up until sort of 30, 40 years ago, if a woman was a widow, she could be killed. Because no one was there to feed her or whatever. And so that's sort of the Dongan, they call them in the book. But that similar thing in Northern Ireland where there were these widows, a lot of widows just left who were then sort of in some ways outside society. Anyway, sorry.
Yeah, I was going to say on that note, you don't make excuses for anyone's behavior in the book, really, but it's the details that you do explicate, both about the Troubles and about the notions of religion in New Ulster, have a journalistic quality, even as the prose, like I said, is pretty metaphor heavy. You feel like you're in pretty good hands. There's not it's a naturalistic book. It's a realist novel, even though it goes to some weird places. It doesn't break a naturalistic narrative like George Saunders might or Karen Russell would. There's no half bat, half human that comes out of the sky and does anything. But
so just to mention the metaphor thing, I do write with a lot of metaphors, but that is also to me an important thing. Like part of the interest to me is understanding that these things are interconnected.
Right.
And once you use a metaphor, you are saying that this thing is like this other thing. And it seems to me dangerous to imagine that these things are separate. And part of the point of the book, part of the point of telling the narratives of the people who are murdered, part of the point of putting very disparate things cheek by jowl is to show that these things are all alike. So the metaphor thing is important to me. Like John Berger has a line about never again will a single story be told. The interconnectedness of things is important to me. I think that's where the truth is in some way. Like it's impossible just to say one thing now because it feeds out into a million other things.
And I mean, this is going to sound completely rote after that beautiful explanation, but there's just something about having a book that's so rich in metaphor, because it's in particular, it's a book about what it is to be human, warts and all, for all of our flaws. And the book is shot through with some extraordinarily beautiful metaphors. And in fact, one of my favorite moments in the book is a funny one. I'll read it in just a second because it's great. But that's a particularly human ability metaphor, right? We know all kinds of other animals communicate through sound and orally. But as far as we know, they can't create a decent simile. As far as we know. Hey, there's some whale who just heard that.
Do you know something else?
Yeah. But I wonder how conscious you are of creating these metaphors as you're writing, or if this is something that seems to come more naturally in the drafting process.
Yeah, sometimes they're there in the first draft, but you're right. It's a very human instinct. There's that wonderful speech in Hamlet, whenever they're lying on the back looking at the clouds, and methinks it seems very like a whale, backed like a whale, all of this. We can't help but see the thing in the other thing. Now, the neuroscience explanation of that would be, well, if you see some specks of orange moving through the grass, you're going to survive if you realize those specks of orange are a tiger. Like, so the ability to see the thing, put the thing together and realize what it is important to us. Evolutionarily, it's important to us. But I love metaphor. It's partly why I'm a poet, I think, really.
Yeah. If I saw a tiger in the grass, I'm a quitter. I would quit. I would lie down and be like, well, I'm done. There's this moment during Alison's wedding. It's sort of the thing that brings everybody back. It's what brings Liz back home. It's her sister's wedding. And this is just an example of one of the kind of extended metaphors that I love. And they're all over this book. It's a real joy just to experience the sentences here. Down the aisle she advanced like a large pale pupa being dragged by another insect, this one dark and a little stiff-legged in his morning suit, the tails of which hung behind like folded wings. As a standalone, it's funny. It's got the kind of of a joke to it. But in the context of a chapter that's fraught and difficult, you get the sense that this isn't going to be a happy marriage. And then you find out, of course, it doesn't quite turn out to be a happy marriage. It seems like exactly the right metaphor. And it only seems like exactly the right metaphor. In the moment, it's funny, but it only seems like exactly the right metaphor about 5 chapters later when you realize how bad things are for Alison. And I thought that was really... And there's 50 examples of exactly that thing. The surprising narrative turns are seeded throughout the first third of the book in a way that makes this, at 308 pages, a completely satisfying read. And I think that's a hard thing to do. I think, I often get to the end of a novel, and if I've liked it, I'm disappointed because I don't quite want it to be over. This felt tighter than that to me. I would read more about them, certainly, but I didn't feel like there was anything you left unsaid. Is there anything you felt you left unsaid or that you took out of the novel before final copy?
Yeah, I'm not a very good fiction writer in that way. I overwrite. Like I will write with all of the fiction. The books have been, another third again, maybe another half again, and then I sit with a pen and just take out. Flaubert talks about the words are like hair; they shine with combing, and I comb and comb and comb. And one part of the joy to me is taking things out. I love taking words out of the books, and I think, because suddenly it's so much stronger to realize what you don't need to say, to point at the thing rather than say the thing is really a joy to me, and I love just removing things. So as long as there's enough stuff at the start, most of my process is taking things out.
Actually, we so often hear the murder your darlings line, so that's kind of nice to hear that it's not as painful as that. It's in fact enjoyable.
I mean that bit is painful. There's always a line you think, oh, this is a really fancy line, and then you think, no, this sticks its head above the parapet. I have to cut it off, and you do lose the thing, the wee fancy thing that you had for ages. You think, no, that this does not work.
Is there some passworded Word document on a computer where you squirrel those things away?
No, there's
They're
not.
just
I
gone.
lose them. They're gone. Yeah, that is.
That's rough.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There we are.
Well, I've been asking all the questions. I'd love to open it up. If you do have a question, we just ask that you take to the mic here because this is being recorded for a podcast. Can I get a quick round of applause for Nick first?
Thanks very much, Nate.
The cargo cult. Our friend asked, and we said we were so excited about you and cargo cult. I wondered if you knew. I'd said, well, I remember it most specifically when Lyndon Johnson was president. And I began to feel
he was a cargo
anger.
cult as well, yeah.
He was a cargo cult guy. There were people who wanted him.
To become a big king, yeah.
When we were, look at the fists in the middle of the Vietnam War. So I try not to be angry because then I wouldn't be able to understand metaphor for today with Trump, for example.
I don't think anyone's asking Trump to be leader of cargo
We
cult.
don't know. We don't know.
Well, it would be good if he did go off and become.
So I didn't know if LBJ is a cargo cult was one of your early interests.
Yeah, I did read about the LBJ cargo cult thing. They were trying to get him to come and be king of a tribe in some way. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's a very weird, resonant little Haile Selassie. Yeah. He's not so much a cargo cult. He was a god in Ethiopia. They just wanted him to be he was like a living god.
But he was selected by the Rastafarians.
Mm-hmm.
Just
Because he was cool.
I get that all the time.
Yeah.
Come lead us. I'm like,
So
I'm
you-
busy.
You
I've got an
can't-
adjunct class to teach.
Right. You can't walk down the street without them.
It's ridiculous.
I was going to go back to the topic of the Troubles, and that the character, the family that lost someone, and the widow you talked about who had to face her husband's killer all the time. I was in Oma the day of the bombing, but I have a sixth sense. I really, really do. My son wanted to stop. I said, no, something's wrong. And even though there'd been a warning, the police didn't block off the streets or anything. They did nothing.
Well, hold on. The police did block off the street. They blocked off the wrong bit because
The wrong
they'd been
part,
given
yeah.
a warning that was
Yes.
wrong.
Yes, that's
Yeah.
correct. Yes, yes. When I saw the footage on the news, that was the corner that we had driven by where my son wanted to stop, and I said, no, we can't. Something's wrong. He said, how do you know? He was just a little kid. I said, I just feel it. And that was 10 minutes before the bomb went off. So that's sort of one of my frames of reference. But, you know, we look at the peace talks. Good Friday was almost 20 years ago. It'll be 20 years next Easter. And yet people still have not come to terms with so much that's happened. Have you seen Owen McCafferty's play Quietly?
No.
Yeah, it's it's a play with only three characters. That
Is this the guy who goes into a bar? to
Yes,
meet the guy?
yes,
I
yes,
read
yes,
it.
yes,
Yeah,
yes,
yeah,
yes.
I read it.
Yes,
Yeah.
so I saw it at the Lyric, which is in Belfast, and it was just such an amazing experience because so many people in the audience knew about that incident and had friends, family, cousins, or someone who was somehow connected to it. And that was only in 2014. So I don't remember exactly when that incident happened that he was writing about, but in the 80s,
I think
was it?
I think Owen's thing is a made up incident, but that
Okay.
it's about a bar, a pub being bombed during a football match, and all the fellas have gone in to watch a football game, and the guy opened the door and threw a bomb
Yes,
in,
yes.
and then went, and then
Yes.
20 years later he wants to meet the son of the guy he's killed. Yeah.
So people related to it, though, because of that similar incident.
Sure.
But here it was, how many years later, and it's still so fresh in people's memories. So when you describe that widow, I mean, of course, that's so real.
Well, look, what has happened in Northern Ireland is that there's no... South Africa had a Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Northern Ireland will not have one because a lot of the people in positions of power are directly responsible for a lot of the murders that happen. So it will not fly. So it's people like Owen McCafferty. It's through art that is allowing these stories to be told.
Yes.
I'm doing
yes.
a poem film for the BBC at the minute in which we interview lots of people who were either themselves victims or had lost people to the Troubles, and they speak to camera directly about what happened. So there are other ways of trying to do something about it, but there's a kind of code of silence in Northern Ireland. This stuff is not discussed.
Absolutely, yes.
Yeah.
And on a side note, a friend of mine in Belfast said he was going downtown to buy your book today for his book club. So there's some book group in Belfast who's reading it in the next couple of
Right.
weeks.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, we'll see what happens. I'm a wee bit worried. I'm in Belfast on Wednesday to do an event, and the first novel was only very lightly involved in the Troubles, and it's still, my parents were getting phone calls at 1 a.m. and people hanging up and telling them to fuck themselves, and so I don't know. We'll see what happens.
Yeah, that was a lighter book than this one.
Yeah. Yeah.
I had something I was going to ask you and I completely forgot what it was. Yeah. Oh, good. Save me.
Yeah, I just was here this evening and walked in, and I'm fascinated by what you all have had to say. I'm just wondering, have you dealt with refugees coming from violent situations recently to New York or to other places you live, and have you interacted? And I'm just wondering what kind of discussion you're part of more internationally right now through this writing.
Weird you asked me that. Last summer I worked, I did some volunteering and interviewing with a home in Kilburn where we had a lot of Syrian refugees who came in and stayed there.
Kilburn in London?
Kilburn in London,
Yeah.
northwest London. And actually I've written quite a lot of poems in the new book based off the back of some of the stuff they told me, and their situations were just unbelievable. I mean, it's not my natural sort of thing. I don't know it very well, but there's the place is run by a friend of mine, and I went in and interviewed people, and we were going out and doing soup kitchens and that stuff. So as it turns out, I have done some of that, but it's not something I would know a great deal about.
Mm-hmm.
But some of the stories were unreal. There was an incredibly, this is not relevant, but incredibly handsome guy called Basil, who was 18. He looked like a kind of movie matinee, and he told me his story, and I still remember it. And he had jumped the fence at Calais, sort of joined the foot passengers, sneaked onto the boat. Was down in the kind of the car bit, you know, where all the cars are parked, and the boat was dropping its moor, opening up the iron thing, and he saw that it was just full of border police in Dover waiting. So he saw that there were keys in the ignition of a motorbike.
Oh, wow.
I know. So he hopped on the motorbike, drove the motorbike off,
That's amazing.
found the police station in Dover, parked up, went in and said, "This is not my motorbike," and gave the keys over. And then when we found him, he was sleeping on a bed of catalogues out the back of an Argos. Argos is a kind of, you go in and you have a catalogue and you pick your thing and you pick if your chit in and you get your stuff. He was sleeping there in Cricklewood Broadway in northwest London, and he was very angry because he had understood if he got to England he could bring his mother over. His father had disappeared in Syria. His mother had sold the amount of land they had in order to fund him. And so the stories are amazing
Right.
and terrible, but you know, there we are.
And sort of a different track than what you're writing
A different
about.
track, but you know, the same things: power and violence, and,
Yeah, and memory.
right. And you know what happens to the small people. The thing about I don't like people in the aggregate. I'm very fond of individuals, but whenever you put them together, they do terrible things. So yes, there we are.
And I also appreciate the how you brought out the tribute to your own mother and examining motherhood just in your presentation and the adjunct presentation as well. So thanks.
I think we have time for maybe one more, if you guys are feeling it, and then you can buy the book and Nick will sign it for you. I should also mention that the pub date was this Tuesday, and so it's a brand new novel. Also, your first two books got glowing reviews in the Times, and you may have seen Jennifer Egan wrote this one a really wonderful review in the Times. So you're kind of crushing it right now, Nick.
It really doesn't feel like that, but I appreciate it.
I'm just wondering, and maybe it was for reasons of metaphor, but the sister Liz, is that right? The professor of anthropology. Why anthropology?
Well, it allows you. So the problem is, and one of the reasons I wanted to do a kind of through the looking glass part. Once you get farther away from something, you can see it better. And part of the point of the anthropology was I wanted one character to have a kind of clear-eyed view of these very weird structures that whenever you're in them, you don't really notice them. Like we all become habituated to acting in certain ways, and sometimes you want to step back and think, well, this is the social construction of reality, and it is weird, and why is it like this? And the anthropology allowed me to kind of do that through Liz. So also because you know it fascinates me. She's a Levi-Strauss scholar in the book, and he's one of my favorite writers. So I was sort of interested in that. So you get to think about Ireland in terms of tribes. So that was sort of behind it.
Me too.
Yeah.
Love it too.
All right, if you'll join me for giving Nick one more hand. Thank you.